Last summer, I decided to tackle a major section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always loved hiking, especially solo trips. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the section, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and hike back over the course of a little more than a week and a half. It sounded straightforward enough at the time. The first few days went smoothly, just as I expected. The trail was everything I had hoped it would be: endless stretches of towering trees and winding paths cutting through serene landscapes. I'm in pretty good shape, so I don't have to stop very frequently when I'm hiking. However, I obviously wasn't going to hike in the dark, so each night, I pitched a tent to get some rest. I've always preferred to keep a low profile, especially since solo hikers can attract attention. Because of that, I ventured a little off the trail to set up my camp each night, figuring it would minimize the chance of a stranger stumbling across my sight. Up until the third night, everything was perfectly fine. But what I'm about to tell you is the reason why I'm taking an extended break from hiking, or any kind of wilderness exploration, for that matter. I woke up in the middle of the night with this odd sense that something was wrong. It was the kind of gut feeling you can't explain but know better than to ignore. I looked around my tent. Everything seemed normal inside. Deciding to have a look around the campsite, I grabbed my rifle, took a flashlight, and unzipped the tent. There was no one out there, or at least, no one I could see. I returned to my tent and started checking my pack. That's when I realized my wallet was gone. At first, I thought I had just misplaced it, maybe left it outside the tent or buried it somewhere in my gear. But after tearing through everything, it was clear someone had taken it. My personal information, cash, credit cards, all of it. How was that even possible? Had someone broken into my tent just to steal one thing and then leave? It seemed unlikely, but losing it by accident was even more uncharacteristic of me. I reluctantly accepted the conclusion that I had probably lost it myself. Things only got worse from there. Over the next few days, I started to notice more things missing, small items, seemingly random. One of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. I knew I wasn't misplacing everything. Someone was stealing my belongings. Part of me didn't want to believe it, but by the fourth day, it was undeniable. I was being stalked. There wasn't any cell coverage on that part of the trail, so it wasn't like I could alert someone about my situation. I remember contemplating turning back, but at best, I'd only be saving myself a couple of days. There was no way I'd be able to hike in either direction without sleeping, but I didn't feel comfortable pitching my tent in those woods, knowing someone was lurking nearby. It was a lose-lose situation. I reminded myself that there was a reason I had brought my rifle, and then a chilling thought dawned on me: why hadn't that person stolen my gun? It was almost as if they were deliberately messing with me. That night, I tied my tent shut from the inside, hoping it would keep them out if they returned. I tried to stay awake as long as possible but eventually passed out from exhaustion. My plan worked, though, because when I woke up the next morning, there was no sign that anyone had been in my tent. By then, paranoia had fully set in. The solitude was getting to my brain, and every second of hiking became agonizing. I don't suffer from anxiety, nor have I ever, but let me tell you, I have never felt worse in my life than I did over the next few days. Just imagine being in my position, no options but to continue hiking, despite knowing someone was watching me from the shadows. The fear was constant. My mind began playing tricks on me. Rustling in the bushes turned out to be nothing. A shadow flickering at the edge of my vision vanished the moment I turned my head. The hallucinations got worse. The one that sticks out most happened when I stepped into what felt like an ankle-deep puddle of water, almost tripping. I heard the splash, felt the cold water soak my sock, but when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there, shocked. It had felt so real. As bad as the days were, the nights were always worse. I tied my tent shut and slept next to my rifle, but nothing made the anxiety go away. At one point, I had to splash cold water on my face to calm myself down. The hallucinations mostly subsided after that, but the worst was yet to come. The next night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I quietly grabbed my rifle, preparing to confront whoever was there, but my body was frozen in fear. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods. There was no way in hell I was going back to sleep after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up camp in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my gear. I couldn't stay out there another night. I was close, Maybe a day and a quarter's hike away from my car, maybe less if I pushed myself. I decided I wouldn't be stopping to sleep that night. I'd push through to get off the godforsaken trail as quickly as possible. I hiked for hours, as fast as my body would allow. As the sun began to set, I gritted my teeth and continued, refusing to stop. By the time it was pitch black, I was so close, probably only 2 hours away. I kept walking, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. Then I heard it. Somewhere behind me, I was sure I heard footsteps. I spun around, flashing my light. To my horror, I saw something slink behind a tree. Adrenaline took over. I aimed my rifle and shouted, demanding they come out. The figure stepped forward. It was definitely a human. But when I tell you it was the most barbaric-looking thing I had ever seen, I am not exaggerating. Words cannot describe what I was looking at. He was wearing nothing but a pair of my shorts, ones I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin was scratched up in several places, and his face was covered in hair. He started walking toward me, despite the rifle aimed at his chest. Before I could think, I fired a warning round into the ground next to him. He jumped at the sound and instantly retreated, sprinting back into the woods. I was in shock. Without wasting another second, I turned and hiked as fast as I could. By the time I made it out of the woods, I locked my car doors and called the police. When they finally arrived, they told me I shouldn't stick around. I didn't need to be told twice. The craziest part of the whole thing, in my opinion, was the hallucinations. I didn't think such vivid hallucinations were even possible. It's going to be a long time before I go hiking again, and I can confidently say that when I do, I won't be alone. I would advise anyone planning on hiking the Pacific Crest Trail to be extremely cautious and carry a firearm. This experience is something I still think about often. Brace yourself for what might be the most unsettling story you'll ever hear. I honestly don't even know if this is the right place to share it, but I have nowhere else to turn. I need to get it out, to tell as many people as possible. I've already shared it with my family, my neighbors, my friends, even reached out to news outlets, but no amount of talking about it seems to be enough. There's this inexplicable urge inside me, like a responsibility, to warn others about what's been happening to me. So, here it is. This story goes back years, over 7, at least. I can't remember the exact year, but if I had to guess, I'd say it was somewhere around 2012, maybe 2013. At the time, I was in my mid-20s, working a stable job, and in a committed relationship with my girlfriend, who's now my fiancé. Since I never went to college, I had been in the workforce for a while and had no real reason to move far from home. Life was stable, predictable. So when my parents passed down my childhood home to me, it felt like a natural next step. The house itself is a relic, an old brick structure that my dad had inherited from his parents when he was around 40. It's been renovated a few times over the years, but no amount of touch-ups can hide its age. The exposed brick gives it away, making it stand out in our neighborhood, where most homes are made of more modern materials. I always thought that made it feel special, almost like it had its own personality. We live in a heavily wooded area, where the houses are spread out, giving each property a secluded, almost isolated feel. Ours is the very last house on the street, which means we don't just border the woods on one side, we're surrounded on two. The forest behind our house is enormous, stretching so far that my brothers and I spent years exploring it as kids without ever mapping its entirety. To some, that might sound eerie, but to me, it was always a source of adventure and peace. I've always preferred my own company, so living in a quiet, secluded space was something I looked forward to. Everything was normal, until that winter. I can't recall the exact month, but there was snow on the ground, so it had to be deep into the season. It was a Sunday morning, the one day a week I got to sleep in. At around 8 a.m., I headed outside to grab my usual morning coffee when I noticed something odd in the driveway. Right next to my truck was a trail of footprints in the fresh snow. At first, I assumed my girlfriend must have gone outside before me, but the more I examined them, the more that explanation stopped making sense. The trail started in the woods and led directly to the driver's side door of my truck, no way else. It didn't circle the house, didn't stop at the windows, and most disturbingly, it didn't lead back toward the road. Instead, whoever left those prints had walked straight out of the forest to my vehicle, stopped, and then turned around, disappearing back into the trees. I remember just standing there, staring, trying to make sense of it. My girlfriend wasn't responsible, and as far as I knew, no one else had any reason to be lurking around our property that early in the morning. It was unsettling, but I eventually brushed it off. Looking back, I wish I had paid more attention. That was only the beginning. It wasn't until about 2 years later, specifically in 2015, that things escalated. I remember the year clearly because it was the same one when my team, the Seahawks, lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. I woke up that morning, walked outside to my car, and immediately knew something was wrong. The entire yard was covered in footprints, everywhere. They weren't just in the driveway this time. They were near the windows, wrapping around the house, scattered across the lawn. It was like someone had spent hours pacing around, studying the property. Now, I'm not someone who scares easily. I like to think I'm pretty rational, but I'd be lying if I said my heart wasn't racing. I had to get to work, so I didn't have time for a thorough investigation. Still, I did a quick lap around the property to make sure no one was still lurking. Finding nothing, I hopped in my truck and sent my girlfriend a text, warning her about what I'd seen so she wouldn't freak out. The whole thing gnawed at me throughout the day, so much so that I ended up leaving work early just to check in on her. When I got home, my girlfriend immediately pulled me aside, her face pale. She pointed to one of the footprints, saying it had been bothering her all day. At first, I didn't understand what she meant, but then I saw it. There were no shoe prints. Whoever had been prowling around our house had done it barefoot. In the middle of winter. That realization sent a chill through me. Who in their right mind would walk around, barefoot, in freezing temperatures? My girlfriend suggested maybe it was an animal, but the footprints were distinctly human, 2 feet, clear toes. I called my dad to ask if he'd ever seen anything like this in all his years of living in that house, but he hadn't. His only advice? Grab your rifle and check it out. I didn't want to go into the woods alone, but what choice did I have? My girlfriend wanted to call the police, but I knew they wouldn't take it seriously. There was no crime, just footprints. They wouldn't waste resources investigating something like that. I promised her I'd call if I found anything concerning. Rifle in hand, I followed the trail into the woods. At first, it was straightforward, but about 30 minutes in, the path split into 2. That stopped me cold. Had I been following 2 people all along? Or had the person doubled back to throw me off? The thought of being outnumbered in the middle of the forest made my stomach twist. I considered pressing on, but the sun was starting to set, and I wasn't about to get lost out there with an unknown number of people lurking in the dark. I turned back. We did end up calling the police that night, but as expected, they dismissed it. Without evidence of a crime, there was nothing they could do. A heavy snowfall that night erased any remaining footprints, leaving us without a trail to follow. And then, just like that, it stopped. For years, nothing happened. My girlfriend and I got engaged, life moved on, and eventually, the whole thing faded into the back of our minds. But then, less than a year ago, it happened again. This time, it was worse. Footprints weren't just all over the property, they led to my shed. Tools were missing. Someone, had been there. My fiancé was in tears, asking if we'd ever be free from this nightmare. Desperate, I called my friend Theo, an experienced hunter and outdoorsman. I explained everything and asked for his help. Equipped with his high-end thermal scope, we ventured into the woods. What we found that night still haunts me. At first, it was just more footprints, more dead ends. But then, Theo stopped abruptly, raising his scope. His entire body went rigid. When he finally handed me the rifle so I could see for myself, my blood turned to ice. 4 figures. Naked. Huddled in the snow. 2 were larger, hunched over, the other 2 smaller, clinging to a tree. They were eating something. I couldn't make out their faces, but I didn't need to. Theo and I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, the figures gathered the smaller ones onto their backs and disappeared into the woods. We rushed back to the house, locked every door, and called the police. Once again, there was nothing they could do. Winter is coming again. My fiancé and I are terrified. We don't know if we'll be here to see another. We need to leave. But I can't shake the feeling that, somehow, no matter where we go, they'll find us again. I apologize in advance if I mess up any details about the story I'm about to tell. This is something that my best friend told me multiple times several years ago. It's one of those stories so unsettling you can't shake it, even after hearing it more than once. My friend's dad was a logger, specifically a tree saw operator. For those who don't know, a tree saw is a massive machine capable of cutting down giant trees and slicing them to specific lengths. His job meant long, grueling hours, often alone in the deep, secluded forest of the Pacific Northwest. The way his logging crew worked, he was paid based on the number of trees he cut down rather than the hours he worked. So, he would often push himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs as quickly as possible. After he and his co-worker finished their part, the rest of the crew would come in to clear the felled trees and transport them to the mill. While he spent about half of his time working alone, the other half was spent with his friend Griffin, another tree saw operator. They used radios to communicate, especially when they worked on opposite ends of the same job site. A number of years ago, my friend's dad and Griffin were assigned to a remote job site high up on a mountain. It took the company over 3 weeks just to clear a road wide enough for their trucks and equipment to make it to the site. By the time they began work, they were positioned in an extremely desolate part of the mountain. They were already 10 days in, making good progress, when they started hearing strange chatter over their radios. At first, the voices were muffled, just faint, static-laden murmurs that didn't make sense. They tried switching channels, but no matter what they did, the chatter followed them. Anyone who's used a standard radio knows how strange that is. It should be impossible for anyone to follow you when you're switching channels. As they progressed farther up the mountain, the voices became more distinct. They couldn't hear full conversations, but based on what they could hear, they both agreed that the tone of the conversation fragments felt off. My friend's dad said it sounded almost casual at times, but the content was unintelligible. They also started finding strange signs that people had been there before them, random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small makeshift campsites. Like I said before, they were in a place so remote it was practically inaccessible, so these discoveries were deeply unsettling. No one should have been up there. One day, Griffin came across a tent hidden just off a trail and called my friend's dad over. They decided to investigate. Inside, they found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with the most disturbing things imaginable: multiple pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude sketches of children being molested. There were even photos of a fresh apple, indicating whoever owned it had been there recently. Griffin wanted to pack up and leave immediately. My friend's dad, ever the workaholic, insisted they finish the job. They agreed to limit radio communication to emergencies only and decided to keep working. That night, they sat in the camper, unable to shake the dread that hung over them. The radio crackled to life again, and this time they could make out snippets of a conversation between two men. They were talking about mundane things, collecting water and firewood, but the realization that these men were likely connected to the tent freaked my friend's dad out. Griffin wasn't as fazed, but my friend's dad was losing it. The next night, my friend's dad decided to confront them. When he heard the men talking about gathering brush for a fire, he grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. The radio went silent immediately, and the men didn't respond. That silence was almost more unnerving than the chatter. Griffin was upset that my friend's dad had announced their presence, and the two of them got into a brief argument before deciding they'd escalate the situation the next day. Around midnight, Griffin shook my friend's dad awake, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first thing he noticed was the soft sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Heart pounding, he fumbled for his gun, only to realize it wasn't loaded. He had no idea where his ammunition was. Griffin was unarmed, and the idea of calling the police was laughable given their location. They both sat frozen as they heard the camper door handle jiggle. The door creaked open but didn't fully swing inward. Their camper was high off the ground, and there was no ladder or stool to climb up. Then came scratching, long, deliberate scratches along the outside of the door. 4 agonizing minutes passed. Finally, my friend's dad nodded at Griffin, signaling he was going to check it out. He moved quietly toward the door, gripping a flashlight in his shaking hand. Just as he reached the door, it burst open, and he was struck across the face with a knife. His pain was blinding. He fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. Before he could recover, a man was on top of him, pressing the knife against his neck. Another man appeared, kicking him repeatedly in the head. Griffin, without hesitation, leapt out of the camper and tackled the man with the knife. The second man bolted into the darkness, and the one Griffin had tackled scrambled to his feet and followed. They disappeared into the forest. Griffin helped my friend's dad back into the truck, and they drove 2 hours to the nearest hospital. It was bad. His face was a bloody mess, and there was a cut across his eye so severe it permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing came of it. 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew finished the job, one of their co-workers was found bound, gagged, raped, and murdered in a ditch. No arrests were ever made. To this day, my friend's dad struggles with PTSD. His right eye, with its disfigured pupil, constantly reminds him of that night. I'm sure he hasn't had a full night of restful sleep since. I've been terrified of deep woods for a long time now, mostly because of my friend's dad's experience. I haven't heard from my friend or his dad in years now, so I can only hope he's doing all right. If stories like this intrigue you, consider checking out *The Nightmare Archive* for more unsettling true stories and unexplained mysteries.